Hi, I'm Jason Gore for ThatShelf.com, and we're here to talk about Steven Spielberg's West Side Story.
Big shelf.
So, a lot of people had questions, like, why bother redoing West Side Story, which was always super weird for me as somebody who's a collector, actually, of musical versions. There's been numerous productions of West Side Story since the original on-stage version, and Robert Wise's film is a classic. It is an incredible, incredible movie, but there's nothing in that story that says that it can't be redone, especially with a new cast and a new take on it. The music itself is interesting because even though Leonard Bernstein's score is essentially a jazz score, it's very much locked into the specific performances, unlike something my beloved Jesus Christ Superstars, for example, where they really mess with your arrangements in fundamental ways, taking essentially a rock idiom and completely changing the way that things work. The changes within West Side Story and its productions tend to be much more subtle. We're not going to get a radically different view of Bernstein's original versions and the original orchestrations that were applied there. Nonetheless, the film was obviously expanded greatly from the type of instrumentation, the expansion of the orchestra and all those elements from the original stage production. And over the years, you've seen some people actually take the music in very different ways. Same thing with the choreography. Jerome Robbins obviously originated the story. Originally, it was going to be East Side Story about Jews and Catholics. That's a whole nother thing. But once it became, sort of took this balletic idea of taking Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet and adding it to sort of a hip jazz score and making it between the Jets and the Sharks and all these elements, sort of spotlighting the racial animus between as they say, sort of underclass whites, as it were, ethnic whites as described, versus the newly arrived, also Americans from the island of Puerto Rico, and the complicated relationship between the Puerto Ricans that actually came over and were finding a life in New York, told that they were Americans as the sort of the sort of nation of Puerto Rico was sort of brought into the American fold, but never fully done so. Something that continues to this day, that whole debates about statehood and all the other elements about what counts as an American, equally a debate that continues not only in that country, but in countries all over the world. So you're like, is Steven Spielberg the right guy to do this? Well, it took, as in his words, 4 homosexual Jews who put it together in the first place. There's something specific about the Jewish immigrant experience, which is at least at its best sensitive to these sort of hostilities and these sort of what counts as you actually being there, and especially the dynamic of New Yorkers about who counted as being truly a New Yorker. I think that there's a very sympathetic eye that was presented here. But if you look at the original film, you had a whole bunch of people telling a story in really remarkable ways. Rita Moreno, Chicares, absolutely bringing in the early 1960s this story to life cinematically in a way which remains breathtaking, and nothing will ever take that away. That being said, there was certainly all kinds of things that were done at the time which weren't necessarily the way that you would want to do them now. Rita Moreno has spoken at length about how all the Puerto Ricans were made brown, taking away the sort of rainbow of complexions that sort of is endemic in an island nation like Puerto Rico that had so many different ways of immigration themselves, so many different levels of dominant cultures and specific elements that made up the complexion, as it were, of Puerto Rico, which equally speaks to the subtleties and the variations within New York society and the conflicts that took place. Tony Kushner's award-winning, incredible screenwriter, did Lincoln, he did Munich, really brings this stuff to the fore in this version. And narratively, it evokes a much more specific and a much more overt confrontation of some of the elements, be it the racial dynamic, the economic dynamic, the connection between the Jets and the police, but equally the overt sexual assault elements, the overt feeling of betrayal, the the feeling that something is being lost that once was, as everybody sort of moves away and other people are left behind, and all of these dynamics at work. In other words, this is a production that isn't afraid to sort of lean into these elements of the original that were maybe a little bit more subtle. We're always there, but we're never made as explicit. And rather than it turning into some sort of political, overtly, almost obnoxiously told tale, it brings forth something that feels as relevant today as the dynamic was at Shakespeare's time, about the almost ignored way that sometimes love and sometimes affection can overcome these fundamental biases, but sometimes that love actually results itself in tragedy, especially for those around them that cannot see people who take the courage to overcome these barriers and take the courage to actually find engagement beyond the silos that sort of separate each other, and find a way to actually have the film have their own lives come to life. And that's really where the film comes to life. So this time you have Ansel Elgort and you have Rachel Zegler. Ansel Elgort, many people will know from things like Baby Driver and the incredibly musical Baby Driver itself. He does a very good Tony here. I think his singing voice is good for this. This role is sort of a thankless role in some ways. He gets a bunch of real moments, but he's the less sort of charming, less engaging of them all. You really feel, though, some of his emotions and some of his elements as it has played here, and I think Elgort is perfectly great in the role. Maybe not the best ever, but he does a very, very good job. Rachel Zegler, who's this young, incredible talent. Out of all the singing versions of this, she is probably my favorite Maria, which is saying something. I think she does the right dial, because as it is an operatic voice in the middle of sort of a Broadway musical, and it's I think it's hard to get that and still feel that it is with the character itself. Obviously, Natalie Wood had Marnie sing her parts for her, so there was always that divide between somebody playing in brownface, as it were, and then having even her singing voice not be her own. Very interesting. Even Rita Moreno, one of her major songs, was not sung by her, despite the fact that she has such an incredible voice, as evident here. One of the really interesting things, I think it's an inspired decision, is to take the same dynamic of the Puerto Rican who's married the so-called American, basically the Latin American with the Eastern European American in the character of Doc. Doc has died, and Rita Moreno has taken over the candy shop where all the Jets play out, and so their interactions with her are fascinating because it actually plays very much into the way that this dynamic works. They don't even see themselves as being prejudicial or being racist. They see themselves as in conflict with specific individuals. We're not racist. We like Rita Moreno's character, but it's these other people, these hoodlums, that we don't really like. And it just showcases all the dynamic at play in a much more sophisticated way. In the same way, if you look at the Sharks, their own prejudices and their own views, their views of behavior of women, all of these, the young girls, all of these elements also showcase. So these are not completely pure characters. This is not victim and victimizer in the most banal way. This just shows the sort of complicated dynamic as it all plays out. We have a bunch of other cast members. David Alvarez, who actually won Tony winner when he was a kid for Billy Elliot the musical. He's one of the three that actually played Billy Elliot. He then gave it up. He joined the army. I mean, there's stories now that all his army buddies didn't realize that he was a Tony winner. He's phenomenal playing the older brother here to Maria. Really exceptional, great physicality. They make him a boxer, so that sort of gives another dynamic of the type of quote-unquote profession as a sports figure that those within this part of New York would actually see themselves sort of literally fighting their way into a different success. You have Mike Feist, also absolutely tremendous as a role as sort of Tony's compatriot within the Jest. He was in the original production of Dear Evan Hansen. He played Connor, the asshole, who eventually becomes eulogized. He's fantastic. He has this incredible, almost, I mean, it sounds like an insult, but it's this almost rat-like presence that he has, this very sneering way. And again, you understand his humanity about what he's losing as he sees Tony slip away. The dynamic that they played of Tony sort of having been imprisoned, and then coming back and wanting to go straight, wanting to find another way, is a really excellent hook into this storyline. And the way that it plays out, I think, really lifts narratively the film up. It's the musical dynamic is definitely at the forefront now. I think that if the original film had a whole bunch of dancers, some of whom could sing, this one has a whole bunch of singers who learned to dance. I mean, obviously, in the background, there's some real incredible talent. But I think that in terms of the visual movement, obviously the original film will always stand head and shoulders above this one. There's incredible dancing moments here, but nothing truly sort of encapsulates Robbins' vision like the original film does. But I think musically this one stands in many ways above and beyond what the 1961, or I believe it is 61 original had. The orchestration is fantastic. I saw it in a film, in a screening room where I wished it was much louder. I have the chance, and we'll do another take on it. It's playing here in Toronto at the Cinesphere, my beloved Cinesphere, the giant IMAX theater, the first IMAX, permanent IMAX film theater in the world. And I'm getting a chance to see it on that giant screen, and I am ecstatic to be seeing it there, because I think sonically it will really engage me in a way that this one, the whole movie, I kept wanting them to turn it up, keep going, because musically it's phenomenal. All you need to do is look at the opening sequence to see just what a gift Spielberg's film is. The original is one of the most iconic opening sequences in cinema history. You're like, how are you going to redo this? Or are you going to make it your own? This beautiful crane shot over up where parts of the original were actually filmed, in and around where Lincoln Center now is. And you see right from the opening moment the changes of New York, the New York that's being lost, the feeling that this is the sort of the area where it's going to be completely gentrified, and a whole bunch of people will never be able to live in that area of the city that they had called their home. That's where they sort of set anchor in. Jets and sharks alike. You see that both of them won't have a place for us. I won't have a place for them in the New York after this element is completely razed. The wrecking balls come in and completely destroy this sense of community, this sense of neighborhood. When you go to that area of New York now, it definitely feels like, I mean, Juilliard's there, Lincoln Center's there, there's a bunch of fancy restaurants, but you get no sense of community. It's nothing like the sort of residual elements of Lower East Side or West Village that still feel a little bit like that part of New York. When you watch The Godfather, you sort of get a sense of what Little Italy was and what Little Italy still is. It still feels that sort of sense of community. All the feasts that take place, in Godfather 3, absolutely echoed. You can go there now and get a slight sense of that. Now, people can complain about what's going on, but that sort of north of Houston area of New York still, at the very least, has that sort of sense. Same thing with Brooklyn. You watch something like Do the Right Thing. Yes, Bed-Stuy has gentrified all to hell, but there's still echoes of that there. When you know about West Side Story, that part of New York has been erased. Absolutely. And so that, I think, that gives a whole nother level about how this film plays out, and just shows it gives context to what the feelings of the Jets and the Sharks were, that both of them were sort of trying to sort of make their way in this community, and being hostile to those that were equally economically depressed, that they could fight amongst themselves because those that were truly controlling the New York at the time, they simply didn't have access to. And it meant that they were fighting on the streets while those economically well above them, frankly, those that were actually paying money to go see it, in the theater were completely divorced from the real machinations on the ground. Obviously, without West Side Story, you don't have things like Hamilton. You definitely don't have things like In the Heights. But it changed fundamentally the Broadway stage. It changed the way that the music is done, the way the dancing is done, and the way that the book is written. Stephen Sondheim's lyrics, he always was mildly ambivalent about that. But I think here the storyline is finally given a space to shine in a way which does nothing, again, to erase the original, but simply celebrates what once was and makes it its own. And I think that is truly the gift of Steven Spielberg's film. It is a remarkable, remarkable movie. It absolutely could have been a disaster, but it shows this. How preposterous is it that Steven Spielberg is somehow underloved, is underappreciated, that he's thought of as just this blockbuster guy? Like, who is he to have the temerity to redo this classic? I think if those with open eyes will absolutely see that in many ways, at least half of this film is the best version of West Side Story ever made, and the other half is just very good and trumped by an equal work of another masterpiece. Just as West Side Story does not erase Romeo and Juliet. It doesn't take it away. For that matter, Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet, which I think is also quite extraordinary, doesn't do anything in any way to interfere with the original. It's just a different take. Just like Joel Coen's Macbeth, which absolutely cuts a whole bunch of other elements out, makes it this tighter story, a very different story, a story of an older couple rather than a younger couple, does nothing fundamentally to erase the genius of Shakespeare's original. I think that we can have these different facets, these different views, and that's what great art can do. This is not redux for the sake of redux. This is not just another remake so that we are using the same IP. This is just a different way of viewing. And I am ecstatic that Spielberg finally had a chance, after hints that we saw, hints in 1941, hints at the opening of the second Raiders of the Lost Ark film, the second Indiana Jones film rather, where we just saw in the Anything Goes sequence, starring his future wife, how he could do the old Hollywood thing. We've seen Spielberg do Busby Berkeley, and I thought that we were going to get a lot of that sort of old school stuff, that the love letter would be to 50s style cinema. And really, I think that this is Spielberg doing Spielberg as a contemporary film that echoes entirely the original production, and I think it's quite extraordinary that way. There we are, West Side Story, one of the great films of 2021, one of the great films, period. One of the extraordinary accomplishments of the long and fundamentally phenomenal career of the Steven Spielberg kid. It pays tribute, it does justice to the work of the four that helped bring it to life. It introduces us to amazing new performers. It showcases Rita Moreno by giving her her moment. In many ways, these two exquisite performances, her original Rita and now her performance where she gets one of the songs sort of gifted to her, and she in turn gives it to us back. There's an anger, there's a ferocity, there's a generosity, there's a tenderness to the entirety of this production, and I think it works extraordinarily well. I can't wait for people to see it and to hopefully embrace it and to watch it several times, to see those moments of subtlety, to see the musical integration, to see how the performers come together, and see how fundamentally this work continues to prove its immortality. For thatshelf.com, I'm Jason Gorber. Thanks so much for watching. Please enjoy West Side Story. Please let me know in the comments what you think. Subscribe, follow us on social media, and we will see you next video. All the best.